The sky above the Pacific was crystal blue on the morning of June 19, 1944. High over the Marianas, sunlight glimmered across the calm sea, disguising the violence that was about to unfold below. From the decks of 16 American aircraft carriers, hundreds of engines roared to life. Before we begin, if you love uncovering forgotten World War II stories, take a second to subscribe. It keeps history alive. The sound rolled across the waves like thunder. Pilots checked their oxygen masks, adjusted their goggles, and waited for the launch signal. Among them sat the men of the U.S. Navy's newest and deadliest machine, the F6F Hellcat. Far to the west, Japanese carrier pilots prepared for their own strike. Many were veterans, once feared as the most skilled aviators in the world. Their aircraft, the legendary Mitsubishi A6M Zero, had dominated the skies early in the war, swift, agile, unmatched. But time and technology had shifted the balance. The men launching from Japan's last great fleet did not yet know it, but they were flying into a storm that would end their empire's air power in a single day. The battle for the Marianas was more than another clash in the Pacific. It was a reckoning. Whoever controlled these islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam, would control the route to Japan itself. For the United States, it was the next step toward victory. For Japan, it was the last chance to stop the tide. By mid-1944, Japan's air and naval forces were stretched to breaking. Years of attrition in the Solomons and the Gilberts had cost them thousands of planes and pilots. Fuel reserves were running dangerously low. New trainees received only a fraction of the flight hours their predecessors had once enjoyed. Yet in Tokyo, the High Command still dreamed of a decisive battle, a single glorious engagement that could halt America's advance and restore national pride. The plan, known as Operation A-Go, called for a massive carrier strike against the U.S. fleet near the Marianas. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa commanded 9 carriers and more than 400 aircraft. His orders were clear: destroy the American carriers before they reached Saipan. But what the Japanese did not know was that American radar, code-breaking, and superior organization had already erased the element of surprise. Aboard the carriers of Task Force 58, Admiral Raymond Spruance and his subordinate, Admiral Mark Mitchell, prepared their own defense. Their fleet was larger, faster, and protected by a network of radar screens stretching hundreds of miles. The Americans knew the Japanese were coming, and this time they were ready. The contrast between the two air arms could not have been greater. The Japanese Zero was still nimble, capable of tight turns and graceful climbs, but it was lightly armored and carried no self-sealing fuel tanks. The F6F Hellcat, by comparison, was built like a fortress with wings. It was heavier, faster, and could absorb punishment the fragile Zero could never survive. Its 650 caliber machine guns could tear a fighter apart in seconds. But the real difference was not the machines. It was the men. By 1944, American pilots were veterans of countless engagements. They had trained against captured Zeros, learned their weaknesses, and practiced coordinated tactics that emphasized teamwork and altitude advantage. The Japanese, once masters of aerial combat, now faced an opponent who knew every flaw in their once perfect dance. The battle began at dawn. Japanese scout planes sighted the American fleet, and carriers Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku began launching wave after wave of attack aircraft. On American radar screens, the blips appeared like a swarm of angry insects, approaching fast from the west. The alarm went out. Bogies inbound, and flight decks came alive. Hellcats roared into the sky, climbing toward the oncoming formation. What followed would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a slaughter so one-sided that even American pilots were stunned. But before that chaos began, there was still silence, still the illusion that Japan could turn the tide once more. From the cockpit of his Zero, a Japanese pilot named Lieutenant Kiyoshi Shiga looked out at the sea glinting below. He had fought since 1942, had outflown wildcats and corsairs over countless islands. He believed, as his instructors had taught him, that skill and spirit would always triumph over machines. That belief was about to die in the blue Pacific sky. By mid-morning, hundreds of Japanese planes were on their way east. Below them, the vast U.S. carrier force spread across the ocean in organized formation. Each ship surrounded by a protective circle of destroyers and cruisers. Radar stations aboard the carriers began tracking the incoming waves more than 100 miles out. American controllers calmly directed squadrons of Hellcats into interception patterns. As the first formations of Zeros and dive bombers approached, their pilots were shocked to find Hellcats already waiting, high above, diving out of the sun. The radar-guided interceptions gave the Americans the upper hand before a single shot was fired. One Japanese pilot later described the moment. They appeared from nowhere, falling from the sky like hawks. Within minutes, the air over the Marianas became a killing ground. The agility of the Zero no longer mattered. The Hellcats were faster in a dive, stronger in a turn, deadlier in every exchange. Machine gun fire ripped through wings and fuselages. Planes exploded midair, leaving trails of smoke that twisted into the clouds. In the chaos, Japanese radio chatter turned desperate. Many of the new pilots had never fought in real combat. Their attacks broke apart before reaching the American carriers. Some, running out of fuel, ditched in the sea. Others never returned at all. By the end of the first hour, the myth of the invincible Zero had begun to crumble. What the Japanese pilots saw that day was not just superior machinery, it was the future of warfare itself. Aerial combat was no longer a duel of honor between warriors. It was science, coordination, and discipline. The Americans had mastered a new kind of sky, one ruled by radar, teamwork, and relentless efficiency. The first wave had been destroyed, but more were coming. Over the horizon, the Japanese fleet prepared to launch again, unaware that their pilots were already gone. By midday, the blue sky above the Marianas had turned into a graveyard of burning metal. Smoke rose in thin black pillars that stretched for miles, marking where Japanese squadrons had fallen. Below, American ships plowed through calm seas, their gunners scanning the horizon for stragglers. The first wave was over, but hundreds more Japanese aircraft were still inbound. Desperate, uncoordinated, and unaware they were flying into a trap. The second wave approached just before noon. They came low over the water, using the glare of the sun to mask their approach. But the Americans were ready. From the carrier Lexington, a new formation of Hellcats thundered into the air. Pilots climbed to intercept altitude, guided by radar and calm voices from controllers miles away. It was a kind of precision warfare the Japanese had never encountered. Cold, methodical, devastating. Lieutenant Alexander Vratsiu, one of the Navy's top aces, spotted a formation of dive bombers ahead. "Tally-ho!" he called, rolling his Hellcat into a dive. Within minutes, he shot down 6 enemy aircraft before running out of ammunition. Others followed suit. Dogfights flared and vanished across the sky in seconds. American pilots described it as shooting targets at an air carnival. The Zero pilots, outnumbered and outclassed, tried to cling to their old tactics: tight, turning fights, sudden climbs, and feints. But the Hellcats refused to play by those rules. They used altitude, speed, and overwhelming firepower. Each pass left another Zero disintegrating into flame. Japanese commanders aboard their carriers waited for attack reports that never came. Instead, silence filled the radios. Only a handful of planes managed to break through the Hellcat screens to reach the American fleet, and most were cut down by anti-aircraft fire. The handful that dropped bombs missed entirely. By late afternoon, Admiral Ozawa's air power was collapsing. His pilots were flying blind, many without proper navigation training. Some turned back before finding the enemy. Others ran out of fuel and vanished into the endless Pacific. Those who made it home found the decks of their carriers littered with the wounded and dying. The cream of Japan's naval aviation gone in a single day. American losses were astonishingly low. Out of hundreds of sorties, only a handful of Hellcats were destroyed. Pilots returning to their carriers spoke in disbelief at the scale of the destruction they had witnessed. The sky had been filled with falling aircraft, so many that gun camera footage later showed Zeros tumbling past each other in flames. For the Japanese, it was a nightmare. The pilots who had once been the pride of the empire now realized the truth. Their enemies were faster, smarter, and far better trained. Even those who survived carried home a sense of dread. They had seen the future of air combat, and it no longer belonged to them. The F6F Hellcat had proven itself beyond doubt. Designed by Grumman to counter the Zero, it combined power and protection in a way that redefined naval aviation. Its thick armor and self-sealing fuel tanks kept pilots alive through hits that would have killed them in earlier planes. Its 6 Browning machine guns delivered overwhelming firepower. But perhaps its greatest weapon was simplicity. It was easy to fly, easy to repair, and utterly reliable. For every Hellcat Japan managed to shoot down, 10 Zeros fell. The kill ratio that day, nearly 20-1, became legendary. American pilots would later call it the most one-sided aerial battle in history. As the sun began to set, the surviving Japanese carriers attempted to retreat westward. The sea around them was littered with oil slicks and burning wreckage. Many pilots never returned. Some ditched near their own ships, only to drown before rescue crews could reach them. For the once feared Imperial Navy, it was the beginning of the end. When night fell, Admiral Mitcher made a decision that stunned his officers. Despite the danger of launching a night strike, something the Navy had rarely done, he ordered his aircraft to attack the retreating Japanese fleet. "Launch the planes," he said simply. "Get the carriers." The decks lit up in the darkness as wave after wave of bombers and torpedo planes took off into the fading light. They found the Japanese ships hundreds of miles away and struck hard. One of the Empire's newest carriers, Taiho, had already been destroyed earlier in the day by a single American submarine. Now Shokaku and Hiyo followed her to the bottom, ripped apart by explosions and fire. By the time the night strike ended, the Pacific was quiet again, except for the crackle of burning fuel and the cries of men in the water. In those few hours, Japan had lost more than 300 aircraft, 3 carriers, and nearly all its remaining elite pilots. The Americans lost fewer than 30 planes. The balance of power in the Pacific had shifted forever. The pilots who returned to their carriers on that long June night knew they had witnessed something historic. The legend of the Zero, the symbol of Japan's air superiority, had been erased from the sky. In its place soared the Hellcat, a machine that represented not just American engineering, but the industrial might of a nation that had learned how to fight a modern war. As dawn approached, the sea was still. The wreckage drifted silently, wings, engines, and the shattered dreams of 1,000 pilots. The great Marianas turkey shoot was over. When the sun rose, over the Pacific the next morning, the sea looked calm again, deceptively calm. The great fleets were gone. Their smoke trails faded into the horizon. Only the floating wreckage and scattered oil fires remained to mark where the empire of Japan's last hope had died. Messages crackled across the U.S. carriers. Victory confirmed. The Japanese fleet was in full retreat, its air power obliterated. On the decks of the American ships, weary pilots stepped out of their cockpits, faces blackened with oil and exhaustion. There was no cheering, just quiet disbelief. They had destroyed an enemy that had once terrified the Pacific. In Tokyo, the news was catastrophic. Admiral Toyoda's headquarters received incomplete reports, exaggerated claims of American losses, followed by silence. Then, the truth emerged. More than 300 aircraft lost, nearly all their veteran aviators dead or missing, 3 carriers sunk. It was, as one officer whispered, the death of the fleet in spirit. Japan still had ships. It still had fuel for a few more battles. But what it no longer had were pilots capable of fighting them. The Empire's air arm, then trained over decades, tempered in countless battles, was gone in 2 days. The Americans called it the Battle of the Philippine Sea. The Japanese called it the Taiho disaster. Historians would remember it as the moment the Pacific War turned irreversibly against Japan. From that point on, every mile the U.S. Navy advanced brought them closer to Tokyo. Saipan fell within weeks. Guam and Tinian soon followed. From those islands, the U.S. Army Air Forces began launching long-range B-29 bombers toward the Japanese homeland, a campaign that would burn Japan's cities and end with atomic fire. But the seeds of that outcome were planted in June 1944, in the skies above the Marianas, where the Zero met its end. The aftermath for the pilots who fought that day was strikingly different on each side. American aviators returned home as heroes. Men like Alexander Vratziu and David McCampbell became legends, symbols of American air power. Their squadrons had rewritten the rules of carrier warfare, proving that discipline, training, and technology could triumph over any myth of invincibility. For the surviving Japanese pilots, the experience left scars deeper than defeat. Many refused to speak of the battle for the rest of their lives. They had entered the sky believing in the spirit of the samurai, that courage and skill could overcome any machine. But the Hellcat had shown them a new reality. War was no longer a test of honor. It was a contest of industry, intelligence, and organization. The Zero's brilliance had been its simplicity and agility, perfect for a war Japan could not afford to sustain. The Hellcat's triumph lay in its strength, endurance, and numbers, the embodiment of an America that could outbuild and outlast any rival. After the battle, American investigators combed the wreckage and intercepted communications, confirming the scale of the Japanese collapse. The once mighty carrier force that had struck Pearl Harbor was now a ghost fleet. Within months, Japan would begin sending kamikaze pilots into battle, not as a strategy of victory, but as a desperate act of defiance from a nation running out of time. For Admiral Spruance and Admiral Mitchell, the victory carried both pride and gravity. They had proven the power of coordination, radar, and modern training, but they also understood what it meant. The enemy had not merely been defeated, he had been erased, The Pacific skies belonged entirely to the United States. On board the carriers that night, flight deck crews washed oil and blood from the decks. Mechanics refueled and rearmed planes, preparing for the next campaign. Pilots slept in their bunks, hearing in their dreams the echo of exploding engines and radio calls that would never answer. The cost of supremacy was not only paid by the defeated. Every man who fought knew that. In the years that followed, the Battle of the Philippine Sea became a symbol of a technological turning point. The day when air warfare became science. The radar operator's screen replaced the scout's eyes. The engineer's factory replaced the warrior's shrine. And in that shift, Japan's era of dominance vanished forever. Yet even amid the wreckage, a quiet respect remained between enemies. American pilots often spoke with admiration for the courage of the Japanese, men who flew into hopeless odds with unwavering resolve. One U.S. ace later said, "They never stopped fighting. Even when they knew they couldn't win, they came at us. You couldn't hate them for it. You could only respect it." And perhaps that was the final truth of the battle. Not hatred, not triumph, but understanding. For in that clear blue sky over the Marianas, two worlds had collided, the old and the new, the myth and the machine. The Zero had been the symbol of Japan's spirit. The Hellcat was the symbol of America's power. When the smoke cleared, the world had changed forever. The age of the samurai pilot had ended, and the age of modern air supremacy had begun. In the silence after the battle, the Pacific stretched endlessly, calm, blue, indifferent. The wreckage drifted beneath the sun, carrying the last traces of an era that had vanished in fire. The Zero had once ruled the sky, swift and graceful, a symbol of Japan's spirit. But the Hellcat brought something different: discipline, endurance, and the cold precision of modern war. In that meeting of opposites, the old world ended. The myth of invincible warriors gave way to the reality of machines, factories, and teamwork. The sky no longer belonged to heroes. It belonged to whoever could master its science. And yet, behind the statistics and victories, there was humanity, men on both sides, chasing duty, facing death, and learning that courage alone could not stop change. When the waves closed over the last Zero, the Pacific grew still again. The Empire's wings were gone, but their story remained, written in smoke and silence, where the sun once glinted off the wings of a fading dream.